So, welcome everyone. I'm Nicola, Chapter Head of London Pavilion, and delighted to have three expert panelists here today to discuss ICP in action, real-world tactics to define and reach your sweet spot. Do you really know your ideal customer profile, or is it more of an incredibly confusing proposition? Thank you, ChatGPT, for that one. That was not one of mine. In their 2025 benchmarks report, Ebsta found that only 18% of pipeline was actually ICP. And we surveyed all of you when you signed up, and only 18% said more than 75% of their pipeline was ICP. Less than half felt that the whole company was truly aligned behind a clear definition. And as for ownership, very scattered: sales, marketing, product, and sometimes no one. Yet we know from the market that when it's done right, a well-defined ICP can sharpen your positioning, shorten your sales cycle, and skyrocket your win rates. So today's panel is here to move us beyond theory, share the real-world tactics, frameworks, and even the mistakes that help you define and operationalize an ICP that actually works. No pressure, panel. So whilst we move over to introductions, please do tell us a little bit about yourself in chat. What percentage of your pipeline do you think is ICP? And any questions you have as we go, we'll try and make sure that we can answer them all at the end. So without further ado, over to our panelists. Ben, please do introduce yourself.
Hi, folks. I am a software engineer turned salesperson and sales leader. And for the last 5 years, I've been working with startups and more established businesses, helping with GTM, improving many things in sales teams and in ICP and GTM strategy. I've worked, I think, about 60 companies over this time, and ICP has probably been a matter of conversation at 55 of them.
Wow. Okay, that's quite impressive. Florence, tell us about you.
Yep, so I'm CRO at General Index. We're a commodity pricing data provider. I have been in the SaaS and data industry now for about 15 years. I've been a CMO for much longer than I am a CRO, so I used to get blamed for when the leads weren't in ICP. But now I completely understand why, because I'm at a slightly different point in the funnel. And all of my experience has been mainly like geospatial industry, AI, and now in energy and commodities, based out of London. So great to be here.
Thank you for joining us. And Mark?
Hey everyone, thanks Nicola. So I'm now a CRO turned founder. So I've done 3 tours of duty as a chief revenue officer. Originally came from more of a marketing background, a bit similar to Flo as well. So I share that sense of, oh God, yeah, other leads in ICP. And now I'm wrestling with the very real world problem of how do we define our ICP as a startup. So definitely some stories to share there as well, but having seen it at more mature companies as well, so I can share kind of both sides of that equation.
So we've got representation, CMO, CRO, and founders. Great. Well, you all know how much I like a horror story. So I would like to kick off with hearing some of your experiences where a lack of clear ICP has really impacted the business. Ben, let's start with you, having worked across over 60.
Sure. Yeah, I struggled to come up with the best example here because there were just so many. But I did pick one, a company that had been selling for a couple of years. It got to 2-3 million revenue. They had taken on some investment. They had brought on a CRO. They were scaling the business fast. And it turned out the CRO and the CEO were not thinking about and chasing the same ICP. In particular, the CRO thought a channel-based model through to smaller companies was going to be much more effective. The company was building a product which was for larger organizations, and surprisingly enough, they filled their pipeline with smaller businesses. Those smaller businesses, some bought, some didn't, most churned, and they kind of knocked the whole business backwards about a year before they realized that they really had to focus on the companies they're building the product for.
So classic lack of alignment.
100%.
And what an impact of a year. Florence, what about you?
Yeah, so I regularly speak to founders and CEOs and as an advisor as well. And I think one of the one that sticks in my memory, which I guess is really relevant now, is who is your ICP? And the answer was any company that wants to get more grunt work done with AI. And I thought, well, that's pretty much every single company right now, and doesn't really help to market to a very specific audience and make sure that people know what the product is for. So I think this wide ICP that's not tightly defined, which I think we're going to talk about later in the questions, is a very common horror story that we see, because people just want the revenue and forget that actually being tight in the ICP and narrowing is very helpful.
Oh, Florence, I've just had flashback to when I started at GoCarda. So not quite as bad as that, but when I asked, it was like, anyone who takes recurring payments. It's like, all right, and there's only one of me in marketing. This is going to be challenging. Mark, what about you?
Yeah, so similar story from my side. This was when I was the chief revenue officer in one of my previous full-time roles, and it was so difficult to pin down the founder to commit to a particular ICP. So it meant we were trying to serve customers literally from 2-3 man bands right up to giant enterprises and everything in between across practically every vertical within the only definition was they had to be a consumer business with some kind of e-commerce presence. And it dragged all of our resources, and it meant we got pretty bloated in order to try and serve all those different customers. So the organization became quite expensive to run. My go-to-market team never quite knew which direction to go, despite my best efforts to corral us into one sense of direction. And probably the biggest impact was on product. It went from being potentially leading in any one area to being meh across all the different surface areas that we touched. So yeah, that was a particularly difficult one.
Yeah, that's such a good point to raise. It's not just about the business you're winning, it's also about your product roadmap as well. And David from Winning by Designs just mentioned in chat that it's the most common challenge he sees with his clients, particularly when designing the go-to-market strategy. So Ben, why is it so important to the success of a business? And having worked across over 60 businesses, what's the difference you see between those that have a clearly defined ICP versus those that don't?
It's so important because the ICP points to everything. It's who you should be selling to. It's who marketing should be marketing to. It's who the messaging is designed for. And critically, it's who you're building the product for. I mean, it's kind of obvious at one extent. If you try and sell to enterprise companies and you haven't bothered worrying about things like SOC 2 or ISO 27001 or whatever, you're never going to do anything. You're never going to have any success. But it's surprising you actually see people doing that. Or if you're trying to sell an SMB product and you haven't got a way that people can onboard it, naturally off the website, or again, you're either going to be completely failing, or you're going to be investing so much in low value sales with high value salespeople that you just, you can't get anywhere. So everyone has to be working on the same thing, because otherwise you'll be saying the wrong thing to the market. You'll be unable to sell it because as soon as someone talks to you, they'll go, oh, that's not what I understood from the messaging. Or maybe they'll look at the product and go, well, that's not what I understood from the salesperson told me, etc., etc. So you really have to be clear as a company who you're building a product for, how you're talking about it, and who you're selling it to. And they all have to be lined up. Otherwise, you're going to be in a complete mess.
And Ben, Seb's just raised an interesting question, actually, which ties into this. How do you know whether it's an ICP issue or whether it's a product market fit issue?
So that's a great point, and that's very much a kind of early stage question, and or it can be a later stage question if you bring out a new product in your market. So one of the things I suspect we're going to come to later is that focus is super important when it comes to product market. When it comes to ICP. But when you're still looking at the market and you're trying to work out whether you've got the right product, then you inevitably have to be a little bit more open and testing more directions. But you have to be very explicit about it. If you say, I've got a product which any business in the world could use, it's some horizontal solution. At the beginning, when you first go to market, it won't work for everybody. There will be small companies, big companies, there'll be different verticals and things, and different people are going to get more or less excited. You have to find the people who are most likely to buy easiest. So when you are early stage, you've got to have some hypotheses. Who do I think it's going to work for? And you have 2, 3, 4, 5 hypotheses, and you just go and explicitly test those and see who does start to buy the product, who does start to get real value from it. And that's where you're testing your ICP, or you're testing for your ICP, looking for that product market fit. And when you do get clear signals, then you should be leaning into those and getting the company behind them.
Thanks, Ben. I mean, we're talking a lot about the importance of ICP, but Flo, how do you actually define what it is? And then how do you keep it, in the words of Seth Godin, uncomfortably narrow without limiting your potential growth?
Yeah, so I don't know if anybody's ever seen that meme on LinkedIn, which is about Prince Charles and Ozzy Osbourne, but they are both male, both born in 1948, both raised in the UK, both live in a castle, and both wealthy and famous. And it's a wonderful example of why, defining your ICP is not as simple as what are the demographics of the account and the individual at the account that you might be targeting. And so, one thing, if I was landing at a company and trying to understand what the ICP is, naturally, one of the first things I would do would be to build a report in HubSpot, both company and contact level with, how many employees, what other tooling do they use, which other competitors have they used. There'll be all these things that are available in HubSpot. But that tells you about your current customer base and is very quantitatively focused. CRM doesn't necessarily capture all of the other good stuff that really tell you what your ICP is. So I would definitely do that report about your existing customer base, as well as the deals you've lost or that are in flight at the moment. But then there's also the whole qualitative side of things. And I think that's why it's so important to, when you join a company and you're really trying to understand if they've nailed ICP, you should be listening to as many gong calls as you possibly can, or whichever tool you're using, and going to as many live calls as you can to really probe on the ICP and capture things that maybe your sales reps haven't been capturing about your ICP. And I think because what might be your ICP today, like your product roadmap might not be building towards that, or there might be regulation coming in the next 3 to 6 months that might really affect who your ICP is. So there are so many factors to consider, and I think sometimes ICP gets stuck in this little demographics box, and actually it needs to be extremely well documented. There needs to be a sales playbook that discusses exactly who are the key personas within that ideal customer account profile. And it's something that should be on every single rep's or person in your marketing teams or customer success manager's desk on day one. And that's a fun thing to discover in companies, and it needs to evolve with the company.
That's such a great takeaway, Florence. Like, make sure that everyone has it well documented and on their desk, so it's in their face. Mark, are there any particular approaches you tend to use when going through this process? And what's the best way AI can support you in really defining your ICP?
So riffing off a little bit of the conversation that's already come up so far, as well as answering this question, I think it depends where you are in your business life cycle, right? So if you are already an established business and you've got some data, let's say at least 12 months of data of sales cycles and churn and so on, then one of the approaches that you can take is to look at that cohort of data and try and find who are your best fit customers. And one of the ways to establish that would be to look at the churn and expansion data within those closed won businesses. There's a really good example of Superhuman doing this. So Superhuman were already on quite a tear as a business, but they were looking at just how much churn they were getting and realized they couldn't get to the next level. So Seb, to answer your question a little bit, arguably they already had product market fit at this point. They were already becoming a pretty established business, but they didn't quite have clarity on who their true ICP was. So they went and they sifted back through all of that data and they looked at which were the cohorts of customers that were really sticky and used Superhuman the most, and then expanded their usage versus those who churned after a few months. And they used that kind of regression analysis to decide this is our ICP, right? This is what this particular tightly correlated group of people love about Superhuman, and we're going to build for them and ignore the rest, right? So they had a relatively established business before they then actually were able to pinpoint their ICP. When you're really early stage, like RevvedUp is and my company, we have to take a series of bets or hypotheses, as Ben was explaining as well, right? We don't have enough data to go back and do that cohort analysis. And so that's a little bit more forward looking, where we believe that the market we can best serve is this market. And then we run a series of tests. Do people respond to our marketing messages? Is it easier or more difficult to get them onto discovery calls? Do they actually close into customers? And then we do now have more and more data to see what's the cost to serve of those customers. Some are more difficult to find a value or to give value to, or just take a lot more time to manage internally. So those are some approaches. Two of the quick points you asked about AI.
Yes, please.
So AI is pretty amazing, given it's trained on trillions and trillions of data points, of being able to give you a reasonable approximation of what a particular, like you could put in any company into ChatGPT, for example, and say, who do you think is going to be their best customer based on all of these parameters? And it will give you a reasonable estimation of those customers are, what their firmographic data might be, what their challenges are most likely to be, what their goals are most likely to be. And we've actually tested this out, speaking to some of our clients, and it's surprisingly accurate in just one or two turns. But of course, it's never going to replicate the internal knowledge that you have. One other thing that I'm hearing a lot of organizations do is utilize their conversational intelligence to get that qualitative insight into what their customers care about, that doesn't necessarily show up in the dashboards, but comes up in the conversations that are happening. So there's a few ideas that people could explore.
Thank you. And really great example of superhuman. And have you found at RevvedUp that as you've been going, you've really changed who you think your ICP is?
Yeah, it's definitely evolving all the time. So very early days, we did the classic startup thing, which was to go for the lowest friction sales, which tends to be with smaller companies, other SMBs, other startups where there's no procurement, there's no legal, and so on to work our way through. But they themselves, for our product, are a relatively unsteady proposition. And so we're finding more and more stickiness with mid-market to enterprise customers. And so the sales cycle is longer, but the value that we can give to them seems to be that much greater, and they seem to be stickier as well. So we are learning as we go.
And I really liked how you raised the cost to serve, because it's not just to acquire, it's how expensive they're going to be to actually manage and show value for as well. Moving on from that early stage, Flo, when you started at General Index, how did you assess how well defined the ICP was there? Because they'd already obviously done the work.
Yeah, so I think one thing I have noticed on how tightly ICP is defined can vary massively depending on how seasoned the founding and executive team are. And, I came into a business with a founder had been in this industry for a long time that really knew the customers inside out, had sold to them before at previous companies, etc. So it was quite nicely defined. Definitely needed some documentation. And actually, that's the best way to onboard into a company is to do an exercise like that. So one of the first things was to look at the existing book of business and fill out any gaps that there were with regards to those contracts that form the overall ARR. So, for example, for all of our deals in the past, were there close lost and close won reasons? That was a big one, to really understand why you won deals. Not just they thought our data was great. No, specifically, what coverage did we have? What delivery method did we have? Was our pricing more competitive? Did they like our licensing terms? There's all this specific stuff that wasn't necessarily being captured. So looking at the existing book of business, also looking at current pipeline. So what pipeline has been stalled? What's stalling it? Do we have a full buying committee attached to each deal to understand if we've got all the key personas there relating to the ICP? And also seeing a target account list. I think sometimes you go into smaller companies and you say, okay, so which accounts are we targeting? And they say, well, the obvious ones. But it's on one rep's spreadsheet that's shared and that has got shared ownership. No one's kind of actually got it into CRM and used HubSpot or Salesforce's target accounts fields, for example, which can actually be really handy to make sure that that's a constantly evolving thing. So target accounts, and then when you look at those close won and close loss reasons, you could very quickly understand what might just have been a bit of luck or timing or founder intros or whatever, and you see what was actually the kind of really replicable stuff, so that we can go out and focus our marketing resources and also our outbound resource on specific types of accounts. And I actually went through the process of doing tiers. So tiers 1 to 3 had a clear definition for each one of those. So it was quite the exercise, and I think it needs to be revisited occasionally. As we launch new features in the product, we see that suddenly new audiences of people become really interested in what we're doing, when we thought that actually the traction was with these guys before. And we're a Series A business, we're growing very quickly, and we're learning new things all the time. So it's a moving parts, I would say.
But when you started, it was really important, obviously, to do that full audit. And although it was relatively well defined, did you find any insights that were actually quite a surprise to the leadership team, to the existing sales and marketing team?
Yeah, I mean, one would be an example of like competitors, right? We assume that we need to have a competitor in a deal, and everybody knows the competitors. And maybe, I'm sure others on this webinar have seen this before, that we think it's almost a good sign when there's competitors on the deal, and there can be, but sometimes there's this kind of blank space where people don't even know your competitors. You don't even need to talk about them or bring them up. So I think there's a lot of that. Like, we can be a really good fit for people that maybe haven't even bought this type of data before. And I think I've seen that in similar flavors in other revenue teams as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Ben, any common issues you've seen with defining the ICP across all those businesses you've worked with? And just an extra one to throw in there as well. How do you actually measure whether you are reaching the right audience?
So the first question, common issues, I think either it's just not defining it or just making assumptions. I've created a product for managing HR teams. Well, who can use it? Everyone can use it. So I should sell to everybody. That's a common issue. Or alternatively, I've got a product for legal tech. So I'm going to say it's all law firms, but not all law firms are equal. And not enough thought is given nearly every situation to actually who are the right set of customers. And there's a really, really important point here that I think we often lose sight of. Your ICP needs to be big enough in terms of the potential bucket of prospects that you can achieve your goals over a particular time frame, say the next 2 years. So say you want to grow your revenue from 5 million to 10 million over the next 2 years. You need to have an ICP big enough to do that, comfortably big enough. So you don't have to get 50% of the market, but maybe you need to get 5% of the market of ICP. But it doesn't need to be bigger than that. And people worry that if they're cutting anybody out, they're narrowing down their ability to succeed. But the opposite is true. The more focused you are, the more successful you'll be. And once you've really nailed that ICP and you've really made progress in the market, you can move to the next step, whether it's different companies in the same vertical or different sizes of companies or something else like that. So there's a real lack of understanding that focus leads to breadth and success as opposed to the opposite.
Yeah, helpful. And
there was a second question. I can't remember what it was now.
Second one. Sorry, I should have played them all at the first initially. How do you measure whether you're actually reaching the right audience?
Well, you can measure whether you're reaching your ICP audience very clearly. If you decide your ICP is companies that meet certain criteria and you are messaging and outreaching and inbounding and all the other things you do to achieve it, and those people are coming to you, then obviously you got it right. If they're not coming to you, your question is, am I reaching out wrongly or am I reaching out to the wrong people? And that isn't an easy question to answer.
Yeah.
But you have to go back to Mark's point, experiment, try different messaging. If you find that group you were pretty confident about aren't engaging, maybe try a group a little bit to the side of them and see if that has more impact.
And to that point, how often do you go to a company's website and you don't really understand who the product is for or what it really does? So it's not a surprise that so often companies have a load of inbound that's nothing to do with their ICP, because actually really putting yourself in the shoes of the target persona is so key to make sure that the messaging drives the right type of inbound. And I think lots of companies struggle with that.
Before we move on to alignment, I'm just going to highlight a couple of questions that have come up in chat because I think they're really interesting. So one question was, is it better to do your ICP audit internally, or is it something you can actually outsource?
If
I
you're
really
outsourcing to me, then that's a great idea. But apart from that,
Yeah, depends who you're outsourcing to. If it's Ben, absolutely. Otherwise, do it internally. Sorry, Flo, you were going to say.
I mean, I think an external pair of eyes can be handy, but I mean, I really do think this is a core part of business activity. The leadership team should care about this so deeply, and everybody should be so in tune with who this ICP is and how it's evolving that I think it would be a shame to outsource it, to be honest. Everybody should be living and breathing this, and everything that should be happening in the company, whether that's a product roadmap in Jira or whether it's a campaign calendar for marketing, everything should be aligned with ICP. So I think there's value in the leadership team co-owning that and delivering it to the business.
Yeah, I'm guessing sometimes it's helpful to get an outside perspective if you can be a little bit stuck in your ways, especially if you're trying to do a big change and have that completely objective viewpoint. But it's got to work really closely with the existing teams. It can't be done as an activity separate to the rest of the business.
I think that's exactly right. The executive team has to own this end to end, as Flo says. But it's often quite hard to see woods and trees. And people have got embedded opinions from whatever they've done for the last several months. So having somebody bring an outside view can be really helpful, but it's more as a to help you get there. It's not to tell you the answer. It is to work with the team to find the answer.
Yeah. And what's that expression? Is it cognitive dissonance, where you've invested so much in a particular ICP, you just really don't want to shift from it, even though if you've got all the signals there. There's a great question from Octave. Is there any criteria correlating to a higher win rate that should not be in an ICP definition because it could make it murkier? For example, a type of trigger like new leadership in a function, push for AI, or decision-making process with or without procurement team.
So yeah, I've definitely got a view on this. I think if you've got to separate out some of the more objective criteria that might make up your ICP that will be relatively static, and others that relate more to behavior. And behavior can be at an account level that would indicate almost like a heat map of interest or readiness to buy. So often if you build your ICP scoring, it's really quite useful to do it as a bit of a matrix where you might have these objective criteria such as, it could be company size, industry vertical they're in, particular team size, the basics that you might all know about. But then you might also have, going along the other axes, these triggers or signals that they're a particularly good fit at this time for you. So that could be things like they've just fundraised, or they've got new leadership in position, or they're hiring for this particular role. And if you can combine those two things together, then you get a slightly more nuanced view of, here's a great fit account. Let's say it's one on the more firmographic criteria, but none of these other triggers or signals that led to a closed won deal are present. So I'm probably not going to prioritize them, even though they're technically in ICP. Whereas something else might be slightly adjacent to that, right? They might be a 2, but they've got all these other signals and triggers going on, which is where you're really going to be able to help them. So you'd want to then elevate those up. So I guess to answer the question directly, I do think it's very useful to add those viewpoints in, but without getting so incredibly niche that you end up with a market of one type of organization that you can sell to.
May I add something to that?
Go, Ben.
I agree with that completely, Mark. And I think I love the way you look at it there with two different dimensions. And in a way, I say it's the dimension of who am I building for? I'm not building for companies where the chief people officer has just changed. I'm building for companies who can use my product, but the ones who might be most ready to buy are where the chief people officer has just changed.
Right.
Then there's other signals which might help you understand who you're buying for. I'm building a database product for people who understand graph databases. This company has just been advertising for engineering roles with graph database experience. Clearly, that is a way of identifying my ICP. So they are slightly different ways of looking at it, depending on whether you're looking for smoother purchasing processes or clearer understandings where they actually are your ICP. And they're all valid, but I love the two-dimensional approach, Mark.
Yeah.
And maybe just to dive into, Chris has asked a follow-up question to that. I think the answer, unfortunately, to your question is you can't, right, to an extent, if it's completely proprietary information to an organization that can only come from a discovery call, it's going to be very, very difficult to qualify someone prior to that conversation. But there's two things you can do. One is you need to be able to qualify people out during the sales process, right? ICP definitions are not just at the surface level, the lead level. You have to be willing and able to qualify people out who look like an ICP fit, but ultimately are not, based on those discovery calls. And then the second piece is you need to do a lot more work around this, but you can potentially find proxies, right? So you know that if this is going on, so this is the root cause in an organization that would lead to them being a good fit. What are the symptoms that are a little bit more identifiable in public that might indicate that root cause exists? And you can do a lot of great stuff with AI around that.
Great. So for those that don't have chat open, Chris was just asking, how do you identify or qualify ICP signals that aren't publicly available and only emerge through deeper conversations or later in the sales process? So Mark was just saying, look for a proxy that may indicate that. I'm going to move us on now, but I'm loving these questions. So please do keep popping them in chat and we'll take them as and when most appropriate. So I think one of the biggest challenges is actually aligning the go-to-market team behind the ICP strategy, and sometimes particularly the CEO. It may be very well defined, it may be very well documented, but then sales continue to sell to a broader customer group, or perhaps the CEO gets incredibly excited about a huge opportunity that comes in outside of the ICP, nice new shiny thing. Flo, how do you manage that?
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? Because I'm sure many of us here work in VC-backed small businesses with aggressive ARR targets, and you feel that pressure. And so when that big potential deal that comes along that looks like it could be easy to close and is outside of ICP, it's difficult to not to want to be opportunistic, and I totally get that. And one anecdote I would share would be around partners. So imagine you're trying to build out a partnership with a really big business that could potentially be a huge source of indirect revenue in the future, and they bring along a deal that's not within your ICP, but is much bigger than your average deal size. Should you say, oh, hey AWS, hey Google, hey whoever it might be, yeah, actually, we're not going to do that deal. And yet you've just been plugging away for 2 years at building a strategic partnership with them. That's really difficult to do. So, should your ICP still apply from partner source deals is a question. And it's, I guess you have to make the call on some of these things with a lot more context for the decision. I've seen that happen a lot between, companies who are maybe focused exclusively on 2 or 3 verticals in the private sector, whether that's FMCG, retail, whatever, and then suddenly a big old public sector deal comes along, which is a whole different monster, as we all know on this call, right? It's like much slower deal cycles. There's loads of, you might have to go through an intermediary to do the deal. It can be a massive distraction for a small business that's got limited resources. So I think the question is, the answer is that it's very nuanced. And the most important thing is that you have a deep conversation around it and get all the context before you make any decisions there, and make sure that the team is focused around that. But it's not easy.
No, Mark, have you seen this at companies like Attest or Student Beans when you've worked there?
Yeah, for sure. So again, a lot of it comes down to maturity of the organization. And what's really difficult is, the classic phrase of what gets you here doesn't get you there. So if you've had quite an entrepreneurial founder who's, gone through the struggle to reach, let's say, 10 million in ARR from potentially lots of experiments and maybe never quite nailing down their ICP, they'll be relatively convinced that's going to continue to work. Right, but it does hit a point of diminishing returns, and then when you get over that point, which was kind of my horror story, it actually acts as a drag on the business. But convincing a founder that what's historically worked is now probably not going to work for the rest of the company life cycle is really, really difficult. I think fundamentally, I've both failed and succeeded in this with, in my CRO roles with founders, right? I've given you a horror story of where I failed. Where I succeeded, I laid it out as a hypothesis-driven approach, much like I'm taking here with my own company, right? I said, look, based on 6 months of data so far, we were very early stage in our go-to-market. It looks like these are the 3 verticals in a very horizontal solution that are most likely to buy. And this seems to be the one use case across all of them that people are gravitating to. So why don't we focus for the next 3 months on just talking about that use case to these three verticals and see if it kicks on our revenue growth. And it happened to be a good hypothesis, and it really did help us focus, and we won more customers in those segments. And then it became a fairly fulfilling cycle, which was fantastic. But that was with a very coachable founder who was open to these ideas. So yeah, I do feel for anyone who's got a founder or CEO who is very rigid in the in their beliefs that you don't want to focus too much because it's going to stymie your ambition, when actually the opposite is true when you hit a certain revenue threshold.
So the question is going to be, Mark, are you going to be a coachable CEO as you grow?
We shall see.
Annika just said something really, really relevant here as well. It's not just thinking about the selling, but ask if you do succeed closing a deal with a client not within your ICP, have you got the resource, knowledge, and product fit to support this, or is it going to completely derail you? Ben, we did a round table on this earlier this year with some Pavilion members in person, and quite a few of these stories came up. What's your view on it?
Yeah, so there were two really interesting, completely contradictory stories that came up. One of them was a guy who was at some very, very, very successful company 15 years ago. It might have been ServiceNow or something like that.
I think it was the Access Group.
Okay, thank you. And he basically said, yeah, we had a couple of million revenue. We had this opportunity to do a $1 million deal with this massive enterprise. We'd never dreamed of going after them. We ummed and ahed, we went after it, and it ended up transforming our business for the better. That became our ICP. That's led to our growth. That was probably the key moment in our company. And then there were in the same room more than one person who said, yeah, we had that conversation. We went after it. It killed the company. And it's really tricky because you don't really know, or you certainly don't know what you don't know. And you've got to have really open eyes and recognize the risk level and the consequences. So if you are selling to small businesses or medium businesses, no more than a couple of million revenue, and suddenly this mammoth enterprise wants you, we're very conscious that it's going to suck up all of your engineering resources. It's going to suck up all of your customer success resources. Is it going to lead you in a direction that you think has a reasonable chance of success? And are you willing to take what's fundamentally a big risk? Most important, it kind of talks to Mark's point, is you've got to do it as a very clear, yes, we are making a bet the company risk. We're not just taking a bit of extra revenue because it will help us get longer runway. We are taking a bet the company risk that might change us for the better and it might screw us. And you've got to be clear on that.
Yeah,
and then you do everything you can to make it work.
Yeah, everyone's got to be behind it. That's so important. So, Flo, with your marketing and sales hat on, we've got our ICP defined. We've got alignment. How do you then build your GTM strategy around this?
So I think one of the first reflections I had upon joining General Index is I wish I could spend the week in the shoes of a commodity trader. It's one of our primary personas that we sell to. And the reality is I've never been a trader. I've never traded oil, I've never traded jet fuel or any of the things that a lot of our customers trade. So to really understand my ICP is you need to try and put yourself in the shoes of your ICP as much as possible. So reading what they read, going to the events that they go to, trying out some of the platforms that they use, like a Bloomberg terminal or a FactSet terminal or whatever it might be. And then as soon as you spend a bit of time doing that, you suddenly realize what campaigns may or may not make sense for your go-to-market strategy. So often we think just in the lane of like, I'm a CRO and I need to sell big deals to these people. So what could I do that would bring in the leads? But I think you need to do it kind of the other way around and think like them. And every time, something opportunistically comes into your inbox, like, oh, should we sponsor this event that's for this community of people? Say, would my ICP be interested in this? If the answer is no, then don't do it and be ruthless about saying no. Sometimes it can be tempting to say, well, it's only a couple of K to sponsor this thing. It's not really prime ICP, but maybe let's do it. But I think you kind of have to be religious about it and keep on telling people in the business the rationale behind it. And everything should trickle down from there. What you're doing on socials, what you're doing on the website, what partners you're partnering with. And I think that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, if only we had the time to spend actually being in the customers' roles. I remember my old boss at Go Cardless, Snapfish, she ended up being the COO at Pizza Hut. And for her first month, she was a week as a delivery driver, a week as a restaurant waitress. I loved it. She was in the kitchen. Such great onboarding. But unfortunately, in the world we live in, we don't really have that time. Mark, when you've got challenging targets, this can sometimes go out the window. Oh, we need to broaden out our ICP to hit these. Is that the right strategy?
Sometimes, not always. So with RevvedUp, so as with my founder hat on, we're quite clearly at a stage where we don't have product market fit. So it's not, and therefore we can't really have an ICP fully defined yet, right? We have these hypotheses, but I don't believe you can truly have ICP until you've kind of got this product market fit, because it's part of product market fit. I do think, and I think Ben's touched on it as well, and I'll not steal his thunder because I think he's got some more comments on this, that there's certain scenarios where it's going to make sense if it's a deliberate decision to say, we can take a punt with expanding our footprint in this adjacent market or to this adjacent type of customer. Otherwise, you might never innovate and you might never find a new market that kicks you onto the next level. But if it is chaos, and there's a very fine line between chaos and innovation, right? I would say, innovation is trialing new things deliberately, with rules and constraints, and then kind of sharing those results back into the organization and learning from them. Chaos is just doing all of that, at pace with none of the rules or guidelines. Sometimes it feels like you're being innovative, but actually you're just being chaotic. And that's where trying new ICP, if it's chaotic, is going to be a terrible, terrible idea.
I love that. Are you being innovative or chaotic? Ben, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, I think there's 2 points here. One goes back to something I said earlier on about our ICP being big enough, because the premise of your question, Nicola, was we're not bringing in the revenue. Do we need a bigger ICP? Yeah. So if you look at your ICP and there's 1,000 companies in it, and based on average deal sizes and revenue goals, you need to close 400 of those in the next 2 years in order to achieve your goals. Well, I would argue very strongly your ICP is way too small. To assume 40% market penetration is just not a realistic goal. So you do need a larger ICP. But if your ICP is 10,000 companies, which you need to close, say, 400, then it's definitely big enough. And if you're failing to make progress there, the question is not, should I make my ICP bigger? Your question is, what's wrong with my current hypothesis? Is my messaging and my go-to-market wrong, or is my ICP wrong? And we're back to the product market fit question that came up earlier on. We're back to the go-to-market comment that Flo just made, which is, shit, it's not working. Let me test things and work out whether there is a different ICP or a different messaging or a different go-to-market should I need to do.
Can I also just jump in really quickly, because I just had a thought around from a buyer's perspective. I don't know if anyone's tried to buy from one of the more established West Coast SaaS businesses, but it's a horrible experience generally, and that's often because they do have very set definitions of who their ICP is, but they've got no empathy if you sit outside of it. So you get rooted around to no salesperson, you get completely ignored. And I do think it's a really important thing to say that once you've got your ICP, if you've got a bunch of people coming inbound or people interested in your solution and they don't fit ICP, it's fine to say, we don't serve you, but don't just ignore them, and maybe even have a reasonable alternative to direct them to, because it does drag your brand down, I think. And you may have seen these rants on LinkedIn around trying to get in touch with someone from XYZ company, and they just completely ignore anyone outside their ICP, which is on the one hand good for their focus, but it's a really poor experience for everyone that's trying to buy from them.
Okay. So one last question before we go into our quick fire round. What is one key takeaway for the audience from each of you? Ben, we'll start with you.
The company 100% from top to bottom must be aligned around one clear ICP definition that everybody understands, buys into, and works on.
Yeah, 100%, and beautifully documented. Flo?
Don't just look at your existing book of business, look forward and think, where's your ICP going in the next couple of years?
Make sure it's innovative and not chaotic. And Mark?
So I'm going to be the AI proponent, and I would say don't be constrained by what used to be the criteria that you could measure an ICP on. You can think much more creatively and deeply these days about what is a good fit account that can be measured and researched by AI tooling.
Nice. Good combo.
That's a great answer to Mehek's question as well, which very much, use AI to uncover those signals.
And if we have time at the end, we can come on to that a little bit more. So quick fire round, no more than one sentence. So what's the most common mistake companies make when defining their ICP? Mark?
Oh my God, I'm completely stumped. One mistake that people make.
When
I'm
defining
going to steal someone else's because I can just see it, but it's not defining it very well.
Ben, did Mark steal yours?
Yes and no. I mean, not defining it, but then are we talking about enough? Are we actually really understanding as a company inside out? Are we repeating it? Are we communicating to everybody?
Yeah, exactly. That repetition is key. Flo?
Servicing metrics on it.
Ah, nice. Staying with you, Flo, what's one word to describe a great ICP? One word, not one sentence.
Tight.
Ben?
Known.
Lovely. Mark?
Enforced.
Okay, with a brutal one. And Mark, who should own it in a startup?
In a startup, it's got to be the founder or the CEO.
Okay, Ben?
Yeah, 100%. Agree with that.
Oh, you gonna disagree or agree?
Well, co-ownership. I was going to say leadership team, but we all know that if it's not got a single owner, that sometimes goes wrong. So I agree with Ben and Mark.
CEO and then supporting total buy-in with a leadership team. So Flo, you just mentioned metrics. What's the most important metric to track to ensure you're targeting the right audience?
Percentage of pipeline that aligns with ICP.
And hopefully it's more than 18%. Ben?
So I think it depends where you are in a business. In an early stage business, often you don't have the metrics you want, like the ideal metrics. So you're going to be looking at things like the level of delight your customers have. You'll be looking at how easy it is to get them to talk to you, how quickly they move through the sales process. I think these are going to be the critical questions when you are still working out if your ICP is right.
That was a very long sentence, but I allowed it because it was so good.
Lots of commas.
And Mark?
So Ben took the earlier stage, so I would go for a more mature business. For me, it would be net revenue retention to tell you whether they're you've got your ICP because they're sticky and they're expanding.
Okay, last question before we go to questions from the audience. How often should you revisit your ICP? I asked this recently, and I think a lot of people said not since pre-COVID, which was quite shocking. So let's start with you, Ben.
So what I normally say is when you see things start to change, Flo mentioned metrics. So, if you see your conversion rates change, you see your inbound rate change, you should definitely be thinking about that. But probably in an early stage business, at least once a year and quite possibly twice a year.
Flo?
Early stage business, quarterly. Keep an eye on it.
Okay. And Mark?
So I think it has to be tied to your strategy reviews. So whenever you do that, probably every 6 months. I think if it's a lot sooner than that, then it feels like you've got whiplash because you don't know where to focus from one quarter to the next. And if it's beyond 12 months, then you're probably missing something.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to move on to some of the questions that have come up to chat. And for once, we actually have 10 minutes to cover them, which is great. So I'm going to go back to Fraser. Something that you mentioned, Flo. How easy was it to get the sales teams on board with adding in that information for deals one? Why a customer has bought your solution?
Yeah, so I think most of the time when a rep closes a deal and that DocuSign comes through and you have to fill out the close one reason, you just want to get it done and start thinking about how you're going to spend your commission in the case of many reps, rather than actually writing a meaningful paragraph of why the deal was won. So I've done a couple of things. One is I turned on notifications that when a deal is closed won, everybody in the leadership team receives an automated email from HubSpot saying the amount, what we sold, why we won it. So if they write something a bit lame, they now know that something a bit lame will go to the whole leadership team, which forces people to actually give that granularity on why we won it or why we lost it. I do it for both because we should also look at our failures too. And the other thing I do is normally in the board meeting, I do talk about why we're winning deals, why we're losing deals. And so I always like to show in the sales meeting a little excerpt of what I'm taking to the board so that they know that, you know, this is not just important to me and it's not me being pedantic about knowing why I won. It's that, you know, the people who have invested in us really care about this. So I guess exposure is a way to make sure that people do it. And they know now that not to put close won or close lost reasons.
Great. Hopefully that helped, Fraser. Question from Rob. How do you see third-party influencers on target audiences being an impact to ICP, specifically implementation partners who are perhaps influenced elsewhere in the market? Who wants to take that one? Ben?
I'm happy to add a thought or two here. Hidden in that question is how well qualified your implementation partners are for your business. And one of the problems is, as startups particularly, you tend to be struggling to persuade partners to engage with you, and therefore you take what you get, and you could take the wrong people or discover they're the wrong people down the line. I think you have to be willing to drive quite hard with your partners and say, no, that doesn't work. That's not going to be successful, because of the alternative is you end up selling stuff and the partners are unhappy. That was in fact the sob story I said right back at the beginning. Is exactly what happened. The partners got unhappy because they sold deals and then the customers churned. So I think you have to be clear on what you're doing, but listen to them. If they're bringing some really good information to you that you weren't otherwise seeing, then you should work out what that means for you, but you shouldn't automatically follow them.
Yeah, great one. And I just wanted to come back to Mayek's question. What are your favorite methods or tools for uncovering deeper ICP signals? It's easy to filter B2B companies by industry revenue and headcount, but how do you identify those that use specific software or pursue particular business objectives? Mark, any tips on tools, prompts, anything like that?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, it's relatively trivial now with, I mean, I can name a bunch of tools. So Perplexity is a great research tool for doing kind of one-on-one account research. I'm sure everyone on here has heard of Clay. RevvedUp itself does a lot of this as well. And there's a bunch of other tools out there as well that can give you access to 10Ks or annual reports and earnings calls. You can uncover social signals relatively easily. Of course, all the things around open roles and hiring, and going so far, not just looking at job roles that are hiring for, but actually going and reading the job description, right? And then you can see in the substance of the job description, are they talking about the types of challenges or goals that your organization can help with? Right, so the level of granularity and qualitative detail you can now pull out of public records is absolutely incredible, right? Even though I'm working with this every day, it almost never fails to blow my mind just what you can find online that will inform you of these various different public signals. And then the question is, how do you work? So there's a little bit of working backwards then from, well, what chicken egg, right? What can you find that will then inform your thinking around ICP? Because obviously there's no point having criteria that you cannot find, but also just having this viewpoint of, well, I think these are the commonalities amongst my most recent cohort of closed-won businesses. How do I go out and publicly find either that direct information or proxies of that information, which I spoke about earlier? But definitely, if you haven't tried Perplexity, that's a really easy route in. I think that's a really easy route in. ChatGPT, Claude have similar facilities now with deep research on OpenAI. So if no one's tried that, you can start to essentially write whole briefs and reports, and it will pull in dozens and dozens of publicly available sources, a bit like Perplexity if you switch on the deep research functionality, and it will even help you clarify the brief ahead of time. Yeah, I could go on. There's so many things you can do.
If you've got any more questions on AI tools, then definitely ping Mark a message on LinkedIn. I'm sure he'd be happy to help. Ben, anything you wanted to add on there?
I agree with everything you said there. I mean, it all comes down to AI these days. I mean, I was looking at a tool recently, salesmotion.io, where they actually will look at the transcripts of any podcasts that anyone that works at your target company was at to see what they talked about in the last 6 months, which again, you could do through deep research as well. There's nothing magic there, but absolutely agree. That's exactly what we should be doing. And then one other thing, a couple of people have asked about things we cannot see. And one of the ways you can identify those is you kind of make them sort of self-fulfilling. So if, for example, your criteria is they have to have multiple legal entities in the UK, made that up, and that's going to be really valuable, so you'll make your product really valuable, you can simply send a message to all the relevant people saying, are you struggling with multiple legal entities in the UK in managing blah, blah, blah? And the people who are will probably say yes, or at least they'll click the link and dig in a little bit more. That's a bad example because you can't find that out online. But you can always ask that question and people will self-qualify by responding to a very clear question about their situation that you can clearly help with.
Yeah, super helpful. Thanks, Ben. Last question. I'm going to ask Flo this because you've worn the CMO and the CRO hat. Ultimately, we've said the CEO should own this, but who do you think should take responsibility for really driving this forward within that go-to-market team?
I think there definitely is a case to be made for the CMO to have to drive it, because if you think about the chronology of a funnel, it all starts at the top, right? And if you've got bad leads coming in that don't align with ICP at the top, then what trickles down through over the next 3 months, if that's your sales cycle, is very dependent on that at the top. So I think actually, your CMO making sure that your playbook, your messaging and everything revolves around that, so that at the beginning of the cycle, we're starting well and we're aligned with that, then that kind of makes sense to me. I mean, the CRO then needs to be the enforcer in a way as things trickle down the funnel. So that would be my take.
Great, thank you. I have one cheeky last question, if that's okay. What happens if you've got a really clearly defined ICP, you're nailing it in your home market, say the UK, and you've now decided to go into a new market, be it US, somewhere in Europe, Australia? How do you then go about working out whether you have the same ICP, you need to change it? I'm going to throw that at Ben, and this is a selfish one for me.
You are doing the same product market fit experiments you're doing in the UK 2 years before.
Right. So
you may have much better reason to believe it works, depending on how well you understand those markets, but you're fundamentally doing those same experiments to see if it works.
Right. Super helpful. Thank you. Well, Flo, Mark, and Ben, thank you so much for joining us today. If people have more questions, are you happy for them to reach out directly to you on LinkedIn? Great. Yes. I will send the recording because you're going to want to watch this again, I know, and also LinkedIn profiles as well, either later on today or tomorrow. But that was so valuable. Lots of great takeaways. Really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.